Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 24, The Suffragette. Eileen Mary Casey was a suffragette, a translator and a teacher. She was born on the 4th of April 1881 in Deniliquin, New South Wales. Eileen has no family connection to me. However, I was given some information about her from the Deniliquin Historical Society, and they suggested that Eileen could be a good subject for a podcast episode, which she certainly was. Eileen was the first child of Dr. Philip Forth Casey, a surgeon, and Isabella Julia Agnes Ray. Philip Forth Casey's father was Edmund Henry Casey, Esquire. He was a landowner at a property called the Donaghy's at Reaney County near Dublin in Ireland. The rental of an estate of 5 townlands amounted to 687 acres and belonged to Edmund Casey, and it was sold to the Landed Estates Court on the 13th of November 1860. Edmund Casey was the son of Thomas Casey, an MP for Kilmallock at the end of the 18th century, and his mother was Wilhelmina Forth, hence the Forth as Philip's middle name. And Wilhelmina Forth was the daughter and co-heir of Neville Forth of Newton House in County Meath. So Dr. Philip Forth came from quite a good background, financially and in standing in society. Following his grandfather Thomas Casey's death in May 1840, the Dublin Evening Mail wrote of Thomas, Mr. Casey was a remarkable man in remarkable times and presented in every sense and acceptation of the term a singularly favourable specimen of the Irish gentleman of the old school, bland and social in habit, warm and frank in manner, cordial and sincere in feeling, courteous and polished demeanour. He was once respected and beloved. With a memory richly stored and a mind highly cultivated, he was the attraction and the ornament of every circle in which he moved, throughout a long and varied life. Mr. Casey sustained his character for honour, independence, high-mindedness and fidelity, and was preeminently distinguished for kindliness of heart, gentleness of deportment, and amiability of disposition. So quite a glowing obituary for Thomas Casey. So Philip Forth Casey was a talented cricketer for Ireland prior to immigrating to Australia. He was registered as a doctor in Ireland in 1869, and by October 1877, he had immigrated to Australia as he was recorded as being registered as a legally qualified medical practitioner in Victoria and was living in Brighton. Philip Forth Casey was appointed as a medical practitioner in Hay and Deniliquin in southern New South Wales in 1877. He was appointed chief vaccinator for the district of Deniliquin in October 1878, and in February 1879 was appointed Chief Medical Officer to the Deniliquin Hospital. He married Isabella Julia Agnes Ray, known as Julia, on the 15th of August 1879 at the Trinity Church in Melbourne. Isabella was the daughter of Major General Charles Ray, who served as part of the Bengal Army in India. Isabella was born in India in 1858, one of 6 children. Her mother, Harriet Frances Allison, the daughter of an English architect, Thomas Allison, died when Isabella was only 10 years old, and her younger sibling at the time was only 4. When her mother died, Isabella was returned to England and was a boarder. Her father stayed in the army in India. In April 1882, Isabella and Philip relocated to Hay, where Dr. Casey was employed at the Hay District Hospital as a medical officer and was a visiting surgeon to the Hay Jail. In March 1890, Dr. Casey sold his medical practice and returned to Europe with his family aboard the Nürnberg. Eileen was then 9 years old. The family settled for a time in Göttingen, Germany, where Eileen became fluent in German. By about 1901, the family moved to England. Philip is recorded as living at Auckland Hill, West Norwood, London in 1914, and at Regent's Park, London in 1922. Dr. Philip Casey died in 1928. Eileen was the oldest of 3 children. I'm going to divert now just to cover her other 2 siblings. Her brother, Edmund Henry Casey, named after his grandfather, was born on the 19th of September 1882 in Hay, New South Wales. When the family moved back to England around 1901, Edmund joined the Navy and was a midshipman and a merchant marine. He enlisted in the Australian AIF in Sydney as part of the 1st Divisional Ammunition Column on the 1st of September 1914 when he was 32. He was listed as single and his trade as a master mariner. His description outlines how he had a snake tattoo on one arm and an eagle tattoo on the other. He was promoted to corporal before he set sail from Melbourne on the Shropshire on the 20th of October 1914. He was moved from the AIF and commissioned to the English Imperial Army in Egypt on the 26th of February 1916 as part of the Northampton Regiment. Edmund died of acute pneumonia on the 2nd of December 1919 that was a direct result of the war. He died at Weihaiwei, China, on the ship Quangping, and he was only 39 years old. Eileen's younger sister, and the youngest in the family, Helena Kathleen Casey, was born in Hay, New South Wales in August 1888 at the Willows in Pine Street. She married Charles Holtham in March 1910 at Yorkshire, England, when she was 21. Helena and Charles had one child, Eileen Olive Ray Holtham, the only descendant of Philip and Isabella Casey, and she was born in November 1913 at Huddersfield, Yorkshire, England. Eileen married Peter Septimus Fuller in October 1940 in Paddington, London, when she was 26. Eileen was a registered nurse and was recorded travelling with her 4-year-old daughter, Sarah Jane, to Ceylon in November 1951, and they returned 2.5 years later. Sarah Jane Lawton has completed much research into her aunt Eileen, and I acknowledge her work when telling Eileen's story. Helena, Eileen's sister, is mentioned in parts of Eileen's story, and Helena died in December 1971, aged 83. Now to Eileen, the focus of the episode. After hearing Emmeline Pankhurst speak in 1910 in England, Eileen and her mother, Isabella, commonly known as Julia, joined the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU. Its newspaper reported, Miss Eileen Casey, an Australian, has much time to the service of the Union, especially in selling the paper as captain of the Victoria Pitch. As a native of a land where women have the vote, she writes that she objects most strongly to the appointment of Mr. Lewis Harcourt as Secretary of the Colonies. And just a little bit about Emmeline Pankhurst and her contribution to the suffragette movement. Emmeline Pankhurst was a political activist. She was a leader of the suffrage movement in Great Britain. A suffragette was a woman who was involved in the campaign for women to have the right to vote. Though often criticised for her strongly militant tactics, Emmeline's contributions towards achieving women's suffrage in Great Britain are well recognised. Emmeline was born on July 15, 1858 in Manchester, England. She had politically active parents. Despite being academically gifted, she did not receive the same education as her brothers. Although her parents supported women's suffrage and the general advancement of women in society, they believed the most important part of a girl's education were the skills to make a home for her future family. At the age of 15, Pankhurst left home to attend the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. In 1878, she married Richard Pankhurst, a barrister who was 24 years older than her, who supported the women's right to vote and Emmeline's political work outside the home. Over the next 10 years, Emmeline had 5 children while remaining active in political organisations, including the Women's Suffrage Society. In 1889, the Pankhursts found the Women's Franchise League, which advocated suffrage for all women, married and unmarried. In 1893, Pankhurst began to distinguish herself as an activist in her own right. She became active with the Women's Liberation Federation, an auxiliary of the Liberal Party, but quickly grew disenchanted with the group's moderate positions. She resigned from the Women's Liberation Federation and applied to join the Independent Labour Party. She was refused admission to the local branch because of her gender, and eventually she did, though, join the National Independent Labour Party. In 1898, after the death of her husband, she took a paid position as Registrar of Births and Deaths in Chorlton. In 1903, Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, a suffrage organisation whose slogan was "Deeds, not words." The group became infamous for its tactics of smashing windows and assaulting police officers, leading to repeated prison sentences for its members, including Pankhurst and her daughters. In prison, the women staged hunger strikes, and the authorities' policy of force feeding garnered significant sympathy for the women. On the 18th of November 1910, Eileen Casey took part in a demonstration at 10 Downing Street against the failure of Herbert Asquith and his government to pass legislation to give women the vote. 159 women and 3 men were arrested, and this included Eileen Casey. And then there was an article in the Dundee Evening Telegraph on the 23rd of November 1910 outlining the demonstration. Scenes of violence unparalleled in the history of women's suffrage movement took place in Downing Street, Westminster. For over a quarter of an hour, some 300 women members of the Women's Social and Political Union fought fiercely and with the utmost determination in the endeavour to break through the cordon of police which had been hastily drawn up at the entrance of the street in order to guard number 10, the residence of the Prime Minister, which was the objective of the women. Exactly 100 arrests were made, including some of the leaders of the suffrage movement. Later, following on a second concerted attempt to get Mr. Asquith's house, several more arrests were made. The following is a list of suffragettes arrested: Emmeline Pankhurst, Catherine Marshall, Eveline Haverfield, Maud Sennett, Mary Lee, Vera Holm, Louisa Garrett Anderson, Bertha Brewster, Kitty Marion, Clara Giveen, Eileen Casey, Lillian Dove Wilcox and Grace Rowe. Sylvia Pankhurst, one of Emmeline's daughters, described what happened that day. As one after the other, small deputations of 12 women appeared in sight and they were set upon by police and hurled aside. Mrs. Cobden Sanderson, who had been in the first deputation, was rudely seized and pressed against the wall by the police, who held her there by both arms for a considerable time, sneering and jeering at her meanwhile. Just as this had been done, I saw Miss Ada Wright close to the entrance. Several police seized her, lifted her from the ground and flung her back into the crowd. A moment afterwards she appeared again and I saw her running as fast as she could towards the House of Commons. A policeman struck her with all his force and she fell to the ground. For a moment there was a group of struggling men round the place where she lay. Then she rose up, only to be flung down again immediately. Then a tall grey-haired man with a silk hat was seen fighting to protect her, but 3 or 4 police seized hold of him and bundled him away. Then again I saw Miss Ada Wright's tall, grey-clad figure, but over and over again she was flung to the ground, how often I cannot say. It was a painful and degrading sight. At last she was lying against the wall of the House of Lords, close to the strangers' entrance, and a number of women, with pale and distressed faces, were kneeling down around her. She was in a state of collapse. Eileen participated in a window-smashing raid in London organised by the WSPU. Although she escaped arrest, at least 213 other suffragettes were arrested on that day. At this raid, WSPU organisers reminded the window smashers that women had the vote in Australia and instructed the women not to smash the windows of nearby offices of Queensland and Victoria-based businesses. On the 4th of March 1912, Eileen Casey, along with her mother Isabella and a fellow suffragette, Olive Walton, smashed the windows of Marshall and Snellgrove's shop in Oxford Street. They served 2 weeks on remand before being sentenced to 4 months, and while in Holloway Prison joined the hunger strike and was forcibly fed. Along with Marianne Hilliard and others, they secretly embroidered her name on the suffragette handkerchief right under the wardens' noses. Casey was awarded a Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, Hunger Strike Medal for her imprisonment. The citation engraved on the bar is for valour, and the inscription says, "Presented by the Women's Social and Political Union in recognition of a gallant action, whereby through endurance to the last extremity of hunger and hardship a great principle of political justice was vindicated." The medal ribbons were in the WSPU colours of green, white and purple. Isabella Casey, Eileen's mother, was also sent to prison for a month for breaking the window of the barber's shop. And when a neighbour commiserated with Dr. Philip Casey, he said, well, if they want the vote, they are right to fight for it. In fact, the whole Casey family who lived in Kew supported the women's suffragette movement. Isabella Casey, as well as Eileen's sister, Helena, known as Kathleen, were arrested for offences connected with the suffragette movement in their home on West Park Road, very close to the current National Archives. It was a house that welcomed any suffragette known to Dr. and Mrs. Casey or not. After Pankhurst's oldest daughter, Christabel, took over the WSPU in 1912, arson became a common tactic of the organisation, drawing criticism against the Pankhurst family from more moderate organisations. At a meeting in France in October 1912, Christabel Pankhurst told Frederick Pethick Lawrence and Emmeline Pethick Lawrence about the proposed arson campaign. When they objected, Christabel arranged for them to be expelled from the organisation. Emmeline later recalled in her autobiography, My Part in a Changing World, written in 1938, "My husband and I were not prepared to accept this decision as final. We felt that Christabel, who had lived for so many years with us in closest intimacy, could not be party to it. But when we met again to go further into the question, Christabel made it quite clear that she had no further use for us." From 1912 to 1914, Christabel Pankhurst orchestrated a nationwide bombing and arson campaign, the likes of which Britain had never seen before and hasn't experienced since. Hundreds of attacks by either bombs or fire, carried out by women using code names and aliases, destroying timber yards, cotton mills, railway stations, MPs' homes, mansions, racecourses, sporting pavilions, churches, glass houses, even Edinburgh's Royal Observatory. Chemical attacks on postmen, post boxes, golfing greens, and even the Prime Minister, whenever a suffragette could get close enough, left victims with terrible burns and sorely irritated eyes and throats, and destroyed precious correspondence. On the 17th of March 1913, Eileen Casey was arrested under the name Eleanor Cleary for placing noxious substances in a pillar box. She was released after she paid a fine. On the 3rd of October 1913, she was arrested under the name Eileen Casey in Bradford. Her sister Helena Kathleen was acquitted. No reason was given for her acquittal, but she was heavily pregnant at the time with her daughter Eileen Olive Ray Holtham. Eileen was sentenced to 3 months, and she went on a hunger strike which resulted in ill health and led to force feeding. However, her fragile state, reported on the 7th of October 1913, only 4 days after her arrest, meant that the force feeding soon came to an end. On the 9th of October 1913, the Chief Constable of the prison received a letter ordering the release of Eileen Casey under the Cat and Mouse Act. The 1913 Cat and Mouse Act was a government response sought to deal with the problem of hunger striking suffragettes. It was known formally as the Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act. This act allowed for the early release of prisoners who were so weakened by hunger striking that they were at risk of death. They were to be recalled to prison once their health was recovered, where the process would begin again. So in Eileen's case, it was stated that if she failed to return to the prison on the 18th of October 1913, she could be arrested without a warrant. Eileen didn't return to the prison, and she avoided going back to prison until 1914. Eileen Casey's great-niece Sarah Lawton accessed records in the National Archives, which included a previous conviction sheet outlining the convictions in 1912 and 1913. And it also had the Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act statement that had instructions to release Eileen Casey. On the 30th of April 1913, the police raided the WSPU's office at Lincoln's Inn House. During the trial, Matthias MacDonald Bodkin read extracts from a document headed Votes for Women, and underneath it had the initials YHB. Bodkin claimed that YHB stood for Young Hot Bloods. The label was derived from a taunt thrown at Emmeline Pankhurst in one of the newspapers, which ran, "Mrs. Pankhurst will, of course, be followed blindly by a number of the younger and more hot-blooded members of the Union." As a result of them being single women, one newspaper described the Young Hot Bloods as a spinster's secret sect. It has been argued that the Young Hot Bloods group included Eileen Casey. Eileen Casey also aided others involved in arson attacks. Unfortunately, though the police were aware of this, they had kept her house under surveillance. On the 8th of June 1913, Clara Giveen and Kitty Marion set fire to the grandstand at the Hurst Park Racecourse as they thought it would make a most appropriate beacon. The women returned to a house in Kew that was owned by Eileen Casey. A police constable who had been detailed to watch the house saw the two women return, and during the course of the next morning they were arrested. Meanwhile, in 1913, several prominent members left or were forced out of the WSPU, including Pankhurst's other daughters, Adela and Sylvia. And as a result, Christabel Pankhurst left England and fled to Paris. Eileen Casey continued her own arson campaign. On the 24th of June 1914, Eileen left her lodgings with a green dressing box and a paper-wrapped parcel and walked to the Nottingham marketplace, where a royal visit by King George V was about to take place as he was visiting a factory in Nottingham's Lace Market. Police officers in the area noticed Eileen's suspicious behaviour around the royal stand and questioned her at the scene about her activities and connections to other militant suffragettes. Eileen admitted to being Eileen Casey, a militant suffragette of the same name, who was wanted for not returning to Leeds prison in October 1913. Detectives arrested Eileen and took her to the Guildhall for further questioning, where they found on her person 20 foot of fuse wire, a detonator, and 5 quarter pounds of cheddite, along with other items as shown in this incredible list. The post-manton contained 2 firelighters, a small bottle of Bexine, 2 boxes of matches, a glass cutter, a pair of pliers, a half-inch cold chisel, 2 flash lamps, a motorist's road map of the British Isles, a map of Nottingham with pencil marks around the marketplace, a book giving information of Derbyshire and district, a book on Southwell Cathedral with pencil marks and notes, and another book containing information of Notts and Derbyshire churches, including the Bredshill Church, which was destroyed by fire a few weeks ago. So you can certainly say that Eileen Casey came prepared. The 900-year-old Bredshill All Saints Church had been destroyed on the 4th of June. Among the treasures lost in the blaze was a 14th century door, 16th century ornate carved wooden benches, and an Elizabethan altar. The Reverend J.A. Whittaker told a Derby Daily Telegraph reporter, "It has been done by suffragettes, I know it has." In Nottingham Police Court, Eileen Casey was charged with loitering with the intent to commit a felony. Within the records are newspaper clippings about Eileen's trial, which took place on the 26th of June 1914, including one in the Nottingham Guardian that notes her protestations, where she is quoted as saying, "This will go on until women get the vote." The article goes on to describe her terrific struggle, with no fewer than 5 officers in the dock upon announcement that she was to be remanded, providing some great insight into her character and the struggle, quite literally, to stand up for women's rights. In a newspaper article outlining the trial, it says, "When Detective Smith attempted to resume evidence, Casey cried, 'When are you going to have Sir Edward Carson here?' She reiterated her decision not to listen and said, 'I hope I shall be more dangerous before I finish.' On the magistrate's ordering the defendant to be remanded, she commenced a terrific struggle with the officers in the dock, struggling with mad futility against the efforts of no fewer than 5 policemen to take her down the steps to the cells." Charlotte Marsh and other members of the Nottingham WSPU cheered and yelled and were carried out of the court kicking and screaming. The police suspected that Casey was guilty of destroying All Saints Church and the planned attempt to burn down Southwell Cathedral. She was held on remand until the 8th of July at Holloway Prison. After going on a hunger strike, she was forcefully fed by a nasal tube at least 46 times, both at Holloway and subsequently at Nottingham and Winston Green prisons. She was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment on the 28th of July 1914, and while incarcerated, Eileen attempted to smuggle out messages embroidered onto a handkerchief. In 1914, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst suspended their suffrage activities to support Great Britain's involvement in World War I, becoming prominent figures in the White Feather movement. The WSPU carried out secret negotiations with the government, and on the 10th of August, the government announced it was releasing all suffragettes from prison. In return, the WSPU agreed to end their militant activities and help the war effort. Christabel Pankhurst arrived back in England after living in exile in Paris, and she told the press, I feel that my duty lies in England now, and I have come back. The British citizenship for which we suffragettes have been fighting is now in jeopardy. After receiving a £2,000 grant from the government, the WSPU organised a demonstration in London. Members carried banners with slogans such as, "We demand the right to serve," "For men must fight and women must work," and "Let none be Kaiser's cat's paws." At the meeting, attended by 30,000 people, Emmeline Pankhurst called on trade unions to let women work in those industries traditionally dominated by men. She told the audience, "What would be the good of a vote without a country to vote in?" As a result of the deal, all members of the WSPU were released from prison and pardoned for committing acts of arson. Eileen Casey was one of them, and she became a land girl and gardener at Kew Gardens after her release. During her militant activities, Eileen had been described by the media as the Bradford Suffragette, the militant, and as belonging to the Derby cell of suffragettes. It is not known how many incidents Eileen was directly involved in during her WSPU militant activities. However, it is thought to number many more than her actual arrests. In 1917, Pankhurst dissolved the WSPU and formed the Women's Party, a political party dedicated to promoting women's equality in public life. In 1918, the Representation of the People Act granted votes to all men over the age of 21 and women over the age of 30. After the death of her mother, Eileen moved to Japan in 1923 and remained there until 1940, teaching English at a girls' school. Meanwhile, Emmeline Pankhurst in her later years joined the Conservative Party and was selected as a Conservative Party candidate in 1927. Emmeline Pankhurst died on June 14, 1928, only a few weeks before the Representation of the People Act extended the vote to all women over 21. Eileen did return from Japan to England briefly in 1928 to visit family and friends and to attend commemoration ceremonies marking the 10th anniversary of the granting of full franchise rights to women. When the Second World War broke out, Eileen moved back to Australia and she became a translator for the Board of Censors. She spoke a number of European languages, including Russian, German and Esperanto, as well as Japanese. She was also an active member of the Australian Suffragette Fellowship and was Worshipful Master of the Emulation Lodge Richmond, which was a Masonic lodge that had both men and women members. Casey also resumed her friendship with Edith Howe Martin, who had immigrated to Australia as well. Edith had also been a member of the Women's Social and Political Union. She was arrested in 1906 for attempting to make a speech in the House of Commons, and this was one of the first acts of the suffragette militancy. She met Margaret Sanger in 1915 and they created a conference in Geneva. Howe Martin then toured India talking about birth control, and she had no children and died in Australia. Eileen moved back to England in 1951 working as a cleaning lady, and for the rest of her life she was a committee member of Calling All Women and was actively involved with the Theosophist movement and Liberal Catholic Church in England. In 1958, Eileen attended a memorial service for Dame Christabel Pankhurst at St Martin in the Fields. Eileen spent the end of her life in a nursing home near her niece Eileen's home in Hampshire. She died on the 12th of October 1972, aged 91, at 50 Marine Parade, Westley on the Solent, a small seaside town near Hampshire, and was cremated at Portchester Crematorium. I hope you enjoyed the amazing life story of Eileen Casey and her beginnings in a small country town in southern New South Wales. I will add photos and records onto my Facebook page, Family History Mysteries, and links to websites that outline Eileen's story.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.